Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by me, Jazz Banga. I'm one of the Cirrus senior consultants with our healthcare leasing division. We have a wonderful topic today. It's on the topic of buying versus leasing your veterinary office space. Essentially, we were commissioned to run today's program and custom content given the demand for information regarding critical facets of a vet's business. We literally get questions 1,000 times a year regarding, should I buy or should I lease? And we typically receive these questions at two pivotal points in a veterinarian's career, when they're looking initially to start their practice, or when a vet is mid-career and planning for their next move, whether to renew the lease or to relocate the business to a property in which they own. And really, the focus of today's program is a overarching review of, what is the best position to go down in terms of buying versus leasing, how to properly structure agreements, and the ideal way to set up a lease or ideal way to set up an arm's length lease when you are the property owner as well as the vet practice owner. So really, we're going to be covering two topics at the same time, buying versus leasing. So to get started, I always like to start off with a bit about our firm, some background on who we are, how we help and advise the vet community, as well as the healthcare community. So just a little bit of background on the firm. We at Cirrus are a healthcare and veterinarian specialized tenant representation firm. We were initially founded by a group of doctors and healthcare professionals back in 1994 to really support the community on a critical aspect of their business, the commercial real estate component. Since our inception, we have analyzed and reviewed thousands of lease agreements all across the country. And since our inception, we've represented over 1,000 practitioners, whether they're owners or occupiers or tenants, and essentially we are well established and equipped to provide guidance and feedback on how to properly structure agreements, how to negotiate a favorable lease agreement, and how to make the ideal business decision as it relates to the commercial component of the practice. Since 1994, we've negotiated over 10,000 lease agreements in the last 25 years. In addition to providing support and negotiating and representing doctors all across the country, we also provide a key aspect in the community, and that comes down to education. Really, knowledge is power, as you all know, and many doctors go into their lease agreement unaware of the implications of the document they're about to sign. So the purpose of today's program is to really give you guidance and how to ensure that the lease agreements are essentially structured in a way to protect the practice to work as an asset rather than a liability, as well as how to ensure that as a building owner that you do have a lease agreement set up between the two entities, one being the property LLC or professional corporation, as well as the practice LLC or PC S Corp, or however which you have the practice set up. And really, we are a premier healthcare tenant representation firm for vets all across North America, work very closely with the Henry Schein Animal Health team, and have been doing so for the latter part of 7 years. So I like to begin the program and start off with, just an idea of some of the clients that we've worked with all across the country, just so you get an idea of the scope of the work that we do. And really, we represent two types of offices. There is the urban office in large metropolitan areas, where there's dense population and, significant patient growth and a patient pool, as well as rural areas that, are more inclined to smaller townships, farms, and ensuring that the agreements are properly set up throughout the process, whether you are in an urban center or in a rural type environment. So great. Many of you may notice or identify some of your colleagues here on the map, and really we've represented the interests of vets as well as dentists, as well as medical practitioners and specialists all across North America, from California, Hawaii, all the way to New York, Florida, and everywhere in between. So essentially our team is set up and equipped to provide real estate guidance all across North America. Our team is consistent of a real estate division. All of our leasing individuals have a background in commercial real estate, and we're really equipped to provide key data and information as it relates to financials, understanding comparables, average rental rates, vacancies, and trends, so that we can properly structure the financial merits of the agreement In addition, our leasing division is supported by our legal team. Our legal team are the individuals that are involved with structuring the agreement, amending key provisions and terms within the lease agreement to ensure that all items are properly structured, the doctors are protected, and that we also are incorporating an exit strategy. Because ultimately, at some point in your career, you will look to transition and sell the practice. As such, the assignment and transfer language, which we will discuss later on in the program, is a critical facet of the lease agreement. So part of my discussion today will be discussing the assignment and transfer language. So moving forward, really on today's topic, the key question is, should we buy or should we lease? So I think it's important to understand the merits of buying versus leasing and how it really fits into your practice plan and your goals and ambitions. For a new doctor that's evaluating how to set up their vet practice, the first question that comes to mind is, do I buy a building or do I go out and find a lease space? Some of the pros and cons of buying versus leasing are identified in today's program. But in terms of buying, one of the initial mindsets that we need to understand is, what are the financial requirements of buying a building? The reality is, if we're looking to start a practice as a new veterinarian or a new dentist or doctor, it is important to understand the significant capital investment of acquiring a building or demising a brand new development or property and the significant costs associated with that. Not only are you acquiring a building, but you would also have to fund the build out of the practice, which, as we all know, is quite expensive if we're trying to build a state-of-the-art practice. One of the benefits of owning real estate is you're a landlord. You have greater flexibility and control over the asset. You have a very valuable asset, as well as the practice is within it and can make clear decisions and have greater control over practice costs, additional costs, so on and so forth. In addition, as a building owner, you can also earn rental income, and that really is a function of the type of building you have, which we'll also discuss further in the program. There are a variety of types of properties, but at a high level, the two types of properties that we take a look at are a single-tenant building versus a multi-tenant building. With a single-tenant building, you would be the sole owner of the property and sole tenant in the building. As a multi-tenant owner, you are one of the many tenants in the building and can derive rental income from the various tenants that are within the plaza, strip center, shopping mall, or however the retail setting is set up. In terms of additional benefits of buying, there's greater flexibility on how you can use the space. In terms of decision making, being the landlord, decisions are fairly straightforward. You simply make the decision and can exercise them accordingly. Whereas as a lease situation, you would need to receive the authorization and consent of the landlord. And then, of course, freedom to control the property. When it relates to transfer or sale of the building and or practice, decision making is, again, very straightforward, as you are also the landlord and occupier. So as a building owner and a new doctor that's looking to set up a practice, financing be a critical component. It is quite difficult to obtain a loan from a financial lender as it relates to building out the practice. There's two investments that are made, the first being acquiring the building and having capital to do so, and the secondary cost of building out the practice to the quality and status that you require. But there's also additional costs in terms of operating costs. When you are the building owner, all of the additional costs as it relates to maintenance, property renovations, electrical, plumbing, damage, destruction, are all costs that you as a tenant and landlord need to bear. Timing is critical in addition. When you're looking to start a business, we need to ensure that we're also balancing our time and efficiency when it relates to buying and timing out the acquisition of the building and the build out of the practice. There's two timelines that you're working on. In terms of leasing the building and being a leased tenant of vet practice, and these are typically found in retail strip settings, plazas where there's a large anchor tenant. And just as a recommendation, when you're looking to start your vet practice, ideally it should be in a space that's leased in a retail strip plaza setting where there is a large anchor tenant that will facilitate traffic flow into the building. We're having great visibility and can really support the community, given we are part of the daily cycle of a customer's needs. You know, a customer goes to a Walmart, the vet practice is also in the retail strip plaza, so very easy from a timing perspective for a prospective client to, you know, not only do some shopping or, you know, go to the mall or, you know, go to do some of their key priorities like grocery shopping, but also we can incorporate and have the vet practice within the facility and the retail strip plaza, which makes it pretty straightforward for them to, you know, drop off their pets and animals and, you know, do some other outside agendas or, you know, some of the work that they require. In terms of leasing, when we're looking to lease the space, the banks are much more willing to provide financing on a lease site because we're not making a significant capital expense in terms of acquiring a building. Banks are much more willing to provide financing on a build-out. So much easier to secure from a lender, whether that's Bank of America, Wells Fargo, TD, and some of the large institutional lenders, much easier to get working capital towards the build-out of the practice. The other benefit of leasing a space is the greater flexibility to relocate or expand the practice. You know, typically we see a lease space leased out for a 10-year term with 2 additional 5-year options. When we're looking to lease the space, we're able at the 10-year mark or 8 or 9-year mark prior to expiration to evaluate, you know, greater business decisions. Do we retain in the local community? Have we built a reputation? Have we built a name brand? And as such, can evaluate whether to acquire a building or remain in the lease space for the long-term purpose. So what really, when it comes to buying versus leasing, it really depends on want versus need. It's not like renting your home or owning your home. We need a space to operate. You may at some point want to own it, but again, as I mentioned earlier, very expensive undertaking to go through a building acquisition while simultaneously building out the vet practice. Now, when we're mid-career as a veterinarian, after building a certain amount of equity, much more feasible to evaluate whether we can go down the path of buying a building and acquiring real estate. Typically at the start of your career, you know, financing is tight. We have significant academic debt and a large debt threshold. So banks are, again, much more hesitant to provide financing on building and practice build-outs, whereas mid-career, once equity is built, much easier to go to the bank and, you know, have a proven model and history of being a quality business owner to obtain the necessary financing to buy a building, build a building, and build out the practice. So really, part of today's program is to cover the pros and cons of buying versus leasing and the benefits between each. So moving forward in the program, you know, there's, again, 2 types of properties that we look at. There is the single tenant unit, which we see on the top here, and a multi-tenant building, which we see at the bottom here. And the reality is, real estate is expensive. And when we're looking to evaluate an acquisition of a building, in most cases, good real estate is A, hard to come by, B, very expensive. The closer we are to metropolitan areas, the higher the cost per square foot is as it relates to acquiring a property. So again, many new doctors find it very difficult to acquire a building, whereas a lease space is much easier to come by, in addition to having, you know, close proximity to your potential patient pool or client pool. So really the focus of today is, you know, if you are going down the path of buying a building, is it a single tenant or a multi-tenant type arrangement? As a suggestion, I always recommend, if we are looking to acquire a building that has multiple tenants, multi-tenancy, so that we can derive further income and offset our costs as an occupier within our building. So if you're starting a career and building a new practice, again, the key items to take a look at are really, what are the financial requirements of acquiring a building? What are the financial requirements of building out the practice and building out the state-of-the-art vet clinic? The timelines involved, if it's a new demise building, typically, you know, that process of identifying land, getting land improvements, and receiving certifications of occupancy is a time-intensive process. In addition, there is also a timeline incorporated in terms of building out the clinic itself. There needs to be variances that are approved. There needs to be site approvals from the local constituents and community to ensure that zoning bylaws are fulfilled and that there is that the space itself is conducive to a vet practice and will allow such operations in that space. In addition, when we're looking at a new practice, we need to focus on the growth of the business and impact of a location. As a new doctor, the key consideration to take a look at is building a brand reputation. As a new doctor, you'll be looking to implant yourself within the community and support the community as it relates to vet and services rendered within. The reality is, as a new doctor, location is key, and being close to metropolitan areas and visibility are critical. So the challenge with owning a building at the early onset of your career is, quite frankly, how do we create awareness over the brand? How do we drive patient and our patient pool to our location? And where are we in relation to the dense areas for our patient pool? And then again, want versus need. Do we really need a building at the beginning of our career, or is it just a want and a desire? And the reality is, all doctors that I speak with at some point in their career would like to own property. Really, the timing of your career is critical to evaluating that business decision. So I always like to incorporate our new practice checklist just to take a look at, what's involved with starting a practice. So as you note here, there's a number of agenda items that need to be addressed, whether you're building a building and starting your first vet practice, or a mid-career and are acquiring a building for your vet practice, or quite frankly, have identified a lease site and are in the position to build out your vet clinic. There's a number of key considerations here, that we like to follow. So this is a great guideline, and at the end of the program, you'll be able to download the vet practice checklist in terms of how to best go through the process and motions of starting your clinic. And really, there's a number of key agenda items that you need to take into consideration as it relates to the build-out and the process involved there. Not only identifying a site, but submitting a letter of intent, negotiating the lease agreement, securing financing, and then going through the construction process. Permits, design plans, retrofitting the space, and ensuring the timeline is consistent with when your open date is scheduled for. So it's a great resource for those of you that would like this resource. It is accessible through our website. I certainly encourage you to check out our Cirrus Consulting Group website, which is found at cirrusconsultinggroup.com. And there is a specific component of our website that is related to vet practices, which you can find this wonderful resource. You can also email me at the end of the program, and I'm happy to send that over to you and share that with you. So I'd like to move into mid-career, the stage of owning a practice. This is typically found when, you establish a reputation for yourself and are now in a position to, really focus in on building out your veterinarian practice and starting to evaluate whether do we stay in the location or are we in a position to really take on a new site and new location. So what you need to consider whether you're planning on renewing your lease or acquiring real estate. For one, does the current location service your patient needs? Are you targeting the appropriate demographics? Is the location of the practice and the clinic close to retail strip plazas? Is it in a mall? Are patients able to run, or your clients able to run errands while they drop off their animals to your practice? Distance is important. If the plan is to relocate the business to another real estate site which you acquire, it certainly needs to be within a close proximity of your current location. Patients typically like to stay within a 5-mile radius of what they're comfortable with. So if the plan is to acquire a building, be sure to be considerate of how far away is the new building to your current location. And then we need to evaluate what is the cost associated with the relocation. It all boils down to financing and capital. At the end of the day, in order to make a true business decision, we need to understand the depreciation of capital, the cost investment of not only building out a secondary practice or relocating the business, but also acquiring the real estate. And lastly, timing of the relocation is critical. We always recommend, if you're in a lease space and evaluating a move, to begin that process 24 months before expiration. Timing is critical. The more time you have, the better business decision you can make. And I have a rule that I like to always advise clients on, and it's called the lights on and lights off rule. We certainly want to ensure that when the lease is set to expire, the lights are ready to be turned on the new location. You know, having occupancy costs on two locations can be detrimental to the profit and loss statement of a vet clinic and can really burn money very quickly. So we want to ensure that our timing is, you know, spot on, that when our lease is set to expire, we're ready to open up the secondary clinic and continue to meet patient demands and needs. Also, it's also a function of marketing. As you evaluate your move and relocation, we certainly want to advise our patient pool and clinical pool where the new location is and have a timeline window so that they're aware of where the practice is relocating and where the future tenancy will be. So really, at the mid-career stage of your veterinarian life, it's important to understand what are the true ambitions of you as a practitioner. Do you intend on maintaining, you know, high patient growth, high patient pool in a lease site, or move that location of the practice and own building and own real estate and have a valuable asset? So really, the decision boils down to a number of items, which include financing, proximity, cost, and timing. So there's a number of considerations to take into fact when we are looking to acquire real estate. So some of the pros and cons of being a property owner are, number one, as a property owner, buying a building or other commercial space provides flexibility over how to use a space and the freedom to control the property. As you are, in essence, your own landlord, you also have the opportunity to build real estate equity. On the other hand, buying commercial real estate comes with its own disadvantages and risks. First and foremost, buying a clinic requires a large upfront financial investment. You'll be taking on quite a lot of debt in the form of mortgage, and of course, there is a risk associated with any real estate investment. You know, markets go up, markets go down, so timing of the market is key as we evaluate property ownership and moving down that path. A veterinarian who purchases a building will also require a great deal of responsibility. And as a landlord and property manager, there's increased duties and obligations that will take time and concentration away from the core business of animal health. Not only will you be a practice and a veterinarian, but now you'll also have the responsibility as a veterinarian. It's also key to separate the real estate investment and your clinic, which is a great topic we'll be discussing today, which is establishing an agreement, a lease agreement, when you own the building and also are the owner-occupier of the practice. Critical that we separate the two entities and have a lease agreement that determines what that relationship will look like. Acquiring a commercial property is expensive and comes with certain liabilities. It is recommended to keep your real estate investment and veterinary clinic as separate business entities so that it's not a veterinarian clinic that is buying the real estate. This helps to maximize the value of each entity and also separates the applicable responsibilities and liabilities. A properly structured veterinarian office lease agreement should be created between the two businesses to provide further protection. This will be important if you ever decide to sell either the practice, the property, or both simultaneously. Another key element there is liability. If there is not a lease agreement between practice and property, we're really exposing both assets at the same time. And really what we look at is if there is litigation or some sort of legal matter that exists, you know, patient comes into the practice and has some sort of injury, whether that's a personal injury, the reality is without a lease agreement in place, the suing party can go after both practice and property. With the lease agreement, we're separating our liabilities and really reducing the depth of the well. And we've had instances in the past where a patient has walked into the practice, had an injury or some sort of concern, and went after both the real estate and practice assets. And really the dual exposure is not advantageous to the longer-term interest of the practice, and we certainly want to separate and minimize those exposures as we go further through our career. Lastly, selling complications in the veterinarian office lease. At the time of retirement or clinic clinical transition, a veterinarian who purchases the property of their office either transitions into a landlord or sells the property. So essentially, you're the owner of the building and are now ready to sell just the practice. It is often quite difficult to sell the clinic and the real, it is often quite difficult to sell the clinic and the real estate property to one buyer. In most cases, the buyer pool that we're looking at can either afford one of the two assets. Either they're going to buy your building or going to buy your veterinarian clinic. And in most cases, the person or individual that will look to buy your building will typically be a vet. So we really do reduce down our prospective pool of buyers. So in the case of a veteran who leases their office space, as long as assignment provisions are well structured in the lease agreement before signing it, they should have the flexibility to sell their clinic or transition out of it by transferring it to another veterinarian, risk and hassle-free. So essential that we have a lease agreement with well-structured assignment language so that when we are in a position to transfer the real estate asset or holding, we have an agreement in place that is straightforward and smooth, has clear designated assignment language where we can go from the transfer from one practice owner to another practice owner. And again, this can only be done if there is a lease agreement separating the two entities. A lease agreement, we have a practice or vet practice clinic LLC and a property LLC, a lease agreement separating the two entities with clear assignment language. So some of the key considerations of leasing a vet space, going back to the leasing side as opposed to the ownership side, location are critical. Location is a critical factor to the success of a veterinary clinic or animal hospital. In many cases, the best clinic locations may not have purchase opportunities. Buying may require you to select from a less desirable or lower trafficked area, and ultimately a less profitable location. Leasing may therefore be the best option for the success of your vet clinic. Again, as a new doctor, typically we advise a new doctor to begin their career in a lease space because reputation is key at the beginning part of your career. Essential that you are accessible, visible, and are in areas where there is a large patient pool and traffic flow. As you build your tenure in your career and establish a reputation, much easier to relocate the business to a building that you own because patients will follow you depending on the value of and quality of the service that you have provided. Number two, in terms of leasing the space, there is significant flexibility to relocate or expand. Leasing office space gives you the flexibility to move if need be. Although relocating a veterinary clinic is expensive and not the most feasible route, there may be situations where it makes the most sense for your personal and professional goals. Perhaps the community location has changed over the years and the demographic is no longer ideal for your practice. What if your business plans have changed and you want to expand and require more operating exam rooms? What about property depreciation and external influences that change over time? Whatever the reason may be, they were likely unknown to you at the time of signing your initial veterinary office lease agreement, making it critical that you fully understand the terms of your lease and its hindrance with leasing. With leasing, you could have the flexibility to move based on changes to your clinical goals and terms in your veterinary office lease agreement. As opposed to owning real estate, when you own the real estate, you're limited to the space in the building that you currently occupy. That is the maximum space that we can occupy. There's very little flexibility to build additional space or operatories or rooms to service, the type of demand that you have for the practice. Again, to do a further expansion of a building, it does come down to zoning bylaws, the mechanisms of the space and area of the land that your property is in. And really, it is a significant cost to build and demise additional space if you actually have to build the physical infrastructure. So with a lease space, that does provide you greater flexibility. We typically incorporate into all of our lease agreements when we're representing the interests of our vets, the right of first refusal. The right of first refusal is a wonderful element to add into your lease agreement, which allows you to expand the practice when available space becomes vacant. And really what the right of first refusal outlines is when vacant space becomes available, you as a tenant have first right to expand. And that's typically done in adjacent space, whether it's to the left of your current lease space or to the right of your lease space. So one benefit of leasing space, it does provide you the flexibility to expand, whereas owning a building, it really does diminish your ability to expand and increase your ability to derive production from the practice. Lastly, leasing space provides you with greater working capital. Buying real estate of your animal clinic will tie up significant capital that would be otherwise used towards building out your clinic, purchasing new equipment and technology, marketing, hiring and training staff. Lease space can alleviate the stress of some of these and other startup costs, allowing you to become profitable sooner. Consider whether investing in business development for your core business. The veterinary clinic will yield higher returns than investing in real estate. So certainly there's pros and cons of both, but in terms of ensuring that we have great capital and the flexibility to expand, lease space typically comes out in favor, albeit ownership of property does provide you greater flexibility and control over the asset and business decisions. So there's benefits and there's pros and cons of both sides of the equation, whether you're buying or leasing. Part of what we will do on your behalf and as you entertain these discussions is to guide you and provide you the best business decision as you make long-term initiatives for your career and career trajectory. So I always like to talk about the leasing side and what essentially is a lease agreement. A lease agreement at a high level is an agreement between landlord and tenant. The reality is it is a significant check. It is arguably one of the biggest checks that you will ever sign in your entire career. The lease agreement is effectively an agreement to rent out space for a certain period of time. In most cases, when we're involved in a new deal or a renewal, we'll look to structure a 10-year deal with 2 5-year options. Now, I had my leasing division pull up an average rental rate report for clients that we have previously represented. And typically, we'll see a vet clinic on average be about 2,000 square feet at an occupancy of $5,000 per month. If we take a look at that and on an annual basis, we're looking at about $60,000 in rent occupancy costs. For a 10-year period, we're looking at a $600,000 investment. Over a period of 30 years, which is the average career of a veterinarian, we're looking at a $1.8 million investment as it relates to rent. So it is a significant cost that you incur over the long-term period of your career. And again, one of the largest checks that you'll ever sign. But the benefit is many of the costs are split amongst the various tenants in terms of additional and occupancy costs, but also you have the flexibility to move and leave the space as you so choose to do so at the end of the term. So key to understand the initial cost, typically that $1 million, $2 million cost will be spent at the onset of your career if you decide to build and occupy your own building versus the cost being amortized over the life cycle of your career in terms of the $1 million cost of being a tenant in a building. So, two key investments here on both ends, whether we take the investment on at the beginning of our career or decide to do so over the long-term period of our career. So there are a number of lease agreements that we evaluate throughout our career. Number one being, with lease agreements, there are a number of leases. We have our triple net lease agreements, we have modified gross, we have a gross lease, and a net lease. I would say 85% of the doctors that we represent and veterinarians that we represent are in a triple net type of arrangement. What does that mean? A triple net lease agreement is an agreement between tenant and landlord whereby the tenant has a set or definitive cost associated with base rent. As I mentioned in my previous example, let's say base rent is structured for $5,000 a month. In addition to that base rent, there are added costs, taxes, maintenance, and insurance, TMI, triple net. And taxes are pretty straightforward. The county or bureau assesses a property cost to the demised building or retail strip center, and you as a tenant are expected to pay your prorated expense. So when I reference prorated, what that essentially means is we take your square footage as a lease tenant and relate it to the total aggregate square footage of the entire building. So for example, if we occupy 2,000 square feet in a 20,000 square foot building, we're effectively operating at a 10% prorated cost. So if the property drives $100,000 in additional cost, you as a tenant will be obligated to pay $10,000 as additional cost split over a 12-month period. The same goes for common area costs as well as insurance. A modified gross lease is essentially one or two of the three costs associated with triple net. So you're paying a certain percentage of either the insurance, the taxes, or maintenance of the building, but not all three. A gross lease is you're effectively paying a percentage of the total occupancy cost and are effectively paying a percentage of production as it relates to the rental rates. And last is a net lease, where all costs are incorporated into the agreement. So you have a one-time payment, and that covers all costs related to your occupancy. So typically, again, as I mentioned, most lease arrangements today are triple net lease arrangements. And part of what we do is we ensure that there's visibility when it comes to lease agreements on additional costs. Taxes being a significant burden, insurance being a significant burden, but we often find the maintenance being a considerable concern for tenants. And what we have noticed, through our last 25 years of being representatives of tenants, is that landlords can often manipulate the occupancy costs or maintenance costs to the benefit of their own business. So as a landlord, at the end of the year, you provide a breakdown of costs to your tenants, identifying the exact cost of maintenance. That includes snow removal, landscaping, parking resurfacing, roof maintenance, general upkeep, contractors, drywall, paint, and things along those lines. Those costs are split among the tenants. What we like to do here at Cirrus is incorporate visibility and transparency with those costs, receiving an end-of-year statement, breaking down and itemizing and detailing what those costs are as it relates to occupancy and maintenance of the building. And at the end of the year, having a right to audit those statements, ensuring that you as a tenant have the ability to formally audit to ensure that the landlord is accurate and consistent with the cost that they're spending and the cost that they're levying to you as a tenant. From our experience as a firm, we've noticed a 30% reduction in cost when it comes to having a right to audit and a reconciliation statement at the end of the term. So key, if you're leasing a space, to ensure that there is some checks and balances when it comes to those additional costs, rather than being expected to pay this cost and really not understanding where those costs come from. I was speaking with a client earlier this morning, and the conversation stemmed around overhead costs. And the doctor was given an $8,000 expense report where they're expected to pay at the end of the year additional cost of $8,000, which was 60% above the estimated costs which were given to them based on the lease. Unfortunately, the doctor did not have a check and balance in place and is forced to pay that cost within 10 business days, or would be forced to be in default of the lease agreement. So certainly we want to ensure that the landlord is accurate in those statements and is not manipulating those additional costs. So moving forward, why is the office lease important when I own the building? So as I mentioned, critical that you as a landlord and tenant, this is the case where you own the building as well as own the practice. You're both the landlord and the tenant. We want to ensure that we're minimizing liability. Ensure that we're separating the two entities, that there is a professional corporation, an LLC, an S Corp, that is the tenant and owns the vet clinic. And we have a separate real estate holding that owns and occupies the building. And there's a relationship between the two entities, although owned by the same party, but two different corporations. And ensure that we have a lease agreement separating those two parties to protect ourselves and minimize liability. And really, if we're looking at personal injury, for example, or damage to the property, we're ensuring that both parties are separated, and that there is one of the two parties that the tenant can, or the prospective client who's causing concerns, when they have come into your property and either had an injury or a fault, or are suing for malpractice or whatever the case may be, we want to ensure that we're minimizing the depth of the well and minimizing our exposures going forward by having that lease created and between the two properties. In addition, if we establish a rental rate, for those of you that own and currently own the building and do not have a lease in place, we can certainly impact the valuation of the building. When properties get evaluated, it's typically done so on the net operating income vis-a-vis the rental rates that are being charged or paid to the landlord. And typically what we like to do is ensure that the rental rates are based on fair market value and are in line with the marketplace to ensure that the property is getting maximum value. So when I reference net operating income, that is a lease cost of the tenants in the building. And essentially what the appraisers will do when they're evaluating the total appraised value of the building is determine the net operating income multiplied by the capitalization rate to determine the true value of the asset. And without a lease or rental income, it's very difficult for them to determine how much revenue is the property deriving. So critical that we establish a mechanism vis-a-vis a lease agreement that designates the exact cost that the practice is spending on rent. It also benefits us from a tax perspective in terms of minimizing our tax exposure in terms of property tax, insurance, maintenance, utilities. There is a significant value in terms of income and income predictability by having a lease in place. The third point here is practice sale. Many doctors are unaware that in order to ever sell the practice while retaining ownership of the building, they do require a lease in place. When you get the practice appraised, just hypothetically speaking, we get the practice appraised at $1 million, a prospective buyer of your practice will, in most cases, look to secure financing from a lender. Some of the large institutional lenders require in today's marketplace a minimum of 5 years of term in order to provide financing. The banks want to ensure that there is adequate term on the lease in order for them to hedge their bet on the loan. The merits of the loan need to correlate with the term of the lease agreement. The amortization cycle of the loan is typically in line with the lease agreement, and in order to ever sell the practice, the banks need to see a predictable rental history. The last thing we ever want to do is, when we're ready to sell the practice, establish a lease agreement at the very last moment while the ink is drying on the paper and the buyer of the practice, questioning those rental rates and looking to reduce the rental rates, which will devalue the property appraised value. So we certainly want to ensure that the lease is set up and well structured so that we can go through the motions of selling the practice. And the assignment language inherent to the lease agreement is critical so that there's a smooth process and a mechanism in place to go through the motions of selling the business. Assignment language that allows ease of transferability, change in asset and control, and ownership of the practice, and that lease agreement is well set up well in advance of the practice sale. We typically advise clients that own their building to establish a lease agreement between practice and property 5 years prior to expiration or prior to transition and your transition goals and when you're ready to retire from the business. So key to keep that in mind, establish rental rates, establish the relationship between practice and property, establish a lease that breaks down the obligations and commitments between landlord and tenant, but also have a clear exit strategy and assignment language. We also want to minimize our tax exposure. Much more favorable tax benefits when we have a lease agreement, looking at pre-tax versus post-tax doctors. So we're also looking at, investor and buyer, the service of debt, our tax burden at the exit of our career, which can be mitigated through a well-structured lease agreement, both with a separate corporation and a separate corporation that owns the lease practice and a separate corporation that has control and ownership of the building. So key to separate those two entities from a tax perspective to minimize that exposure and ensure that as we exit, we can reduce our tax exposures. In addition, when a practice gets appraised, they'll typically look at EBITDA, earnings before income taxes, depreciation, and amortization, multiply the capitalization rate. So really, as we evaluate our exit strategy, the lease agreement is pivotal in minimizing those exposures and ensuring that we're maximizing the value from the sale of the practice. And lastly is flexibility. Again, having a lease agreement that provides predictability not only to you, your family, and estate, but also in the event of death and or disability, if we're unable to operate our vet practice in the building, we have a lease agreement that our estate can transfer to a prospective buyer while inherently owning and maintaining ownership of the building. We want to be tax efficient. If your estate plans to be a landlord, then we need to ensure that there's a lease agreement that allows them to transfer to another party and ensure that that process is straightforward and detailed within the lease agreement. We need to have a detailed asset list. Everything you own needs to be mentioned in your detailed asset list, and ensure that your estate never has to worry about capital or money, that there is a benefit because there's a lease agreement in place to go through the transfer and sale of the practice while retaining ownership of that wonderful asset that you have acquired. So again, just to highlight, there is significant importance as it relates to establishing a lease agreement between practice and property. Be well ahead of the game and well ahead of the curve and establish a lease agreement well in advance of your transition timeline. So what are the benefits of a properly negotiated lease agreement? So going back to the properly negotiated lease agreement, there are a number of benefits. We can maximize the value of each entity, the building and vet clinic. We understand where the rental rates are. We understand how much income the property is deriving. There is a flexible lease agreement. There's protections in place for the tenant as well as the landlord. We want to provide protection to support the future growth of each business. We want to ensure that rents escalate year over year to protect the value of the building, but we want to also ensure that the rent rates that are structured in the lease agreement are based on fair market value and increases based on CPI, the Consumer Price Index, or essentially the inflation or growth of the economy. We also want to establish important details: how much rent you're able to pay every month, what responsibilities and obligations does a tenant have, who maintains the property, who does the general upkeep, and consent language as well, ensuring that if there is any additional alterations, amendments, or further expansion of the lease, that the tenant is forced to receive consent of the landlord. And key as a landlord to have consent language so you can control all business decision-making outcomes and ensure that going forward, the tenant in your building has to approach you to make those business decisions. So when we get involved in establishing a lease, whether you're a lease tenant or a doctor that owns and occupies a space, there are a number of key items and considerations that we take into fact as we design and develop a lease agreement. These critical elements are important whether you're a traditional tenant or owner-occupier. We need clarity and clarity on the established relationship between the various parties in order to have long-term success of the practice. So I'll give you all a moment just to evaluate and take a look at some of these key items within a lease agreement that we look to secure and negotiate. And just as I mentioned earlier, important that all elements are addressed. If the elements aren't addressed, then really it comes to the interpretation of the courts, which becomes a very expensive process. We're firm believers in long leases, leases that deal with all the if, ands, and others. All aspects of your relationship with the landlord, whether you are the landlord and tenant or you're leasing from a landlord, are well structured and established. So in the event of an issue or dispute between landlord and tenant, there's conflict resolution action built into the lease agreement. So important that all these elements are addressed as we evaluate the lease and how that relationship will unfold. So moving forward, as a lease tenant and owner, it's critical that we time the sequence of our events and take top priority in our timeline. The tenant lease cycle is critical. As part of our recommendations, we always mention to our clients to begin their process 24 months before the expiration of their lease agreement. So if you're in a 10-year lease, you want to begin to have the conversation with your landlord 24 months before the lease is set to expire to ensure that you have maximum flexibility in your business decisions, have contingency plans in place. Understand your obligations, understand any, items, understand what your commitments are to the space, but also ensuring, look, as a tenant in a building, in order to affect change to the lease agreement, timing is a key component. As a vet practice, you do provide great covenant to the landlord in the form of being a long-term tenant, providing a predictable rental rate, providing predictable rent, and typically once you build out a vet practice, that space will forever remain a veterinarian clinic. As such, we need to leverage that fact to obtain the best result from our negotiations of a lease space. And in order to exercise all options and opportunities, having the conversation well in advance will certainly benefit us. The closer and closer we get to the expiration date, you'll note here that our leverage significantly reduces. Landlords are aware of the timelines involved with building out a vet practice when it comes to permitting, design, build-out costs, architectural drawings, renderings. These are all time-intensive processes. And if the landlord, very often when we deal with landlords, they look to delay the process as much as possible and as often as possible so that you're within that last 12 or 8 months before expiration or even closer to expiration. What they're effectively doing is minimizing your options. And if we have very few options on the table, then typically what landlords derive from that is the ability to essentially negotiate any element that they so choose to do so in the lease agreement. Really we're backed into a corner if we do not start the process early and often, because we're sort of forced to sign the lease agreement if we do not have the ability to exercise the ability to relocate or buy a building and move the business elsewhere. So starting the process early and often really gives us those flexibilities and key consideration and a significant part of the negotiation tactic. As a group that advises doctors, we always believe, and I want to reinforce the message, 24 months before expiration is key. It is critical to the success and outcome of the negotiation. So with that being said, how do we win the negotiations? Whether you're leasing or owning the building, really the key item is to begin the process early and to gather all documentation to start. Ensure that all documentation, lease agreements, partnership agreements, understanding the architectural drawings and all relationships, any amendments, addendums, riders, options, extensions are all gathered, and we have those critical items on hand. We would look to identify your practice career goals once we've gathered all the documentation. What does a career trajectory look like? How long do we plan on practicing? What is our exit strategy? Is there plans to grow, open up multiple practices, own real estate? But in order to make those decisions, we need to have all documentation on hand. The next step that we look to do is review all the critical items, identify and review all the office lease risks, all the traps or pitfalls within the lease agreement, ensure that we're having that conversation early and discussing all preferential treatment plans going forward. We would then prepare market research, understand what the key demographics of the area are showing, such as average rental rates, vacancy rates, availabilities, and really determine out what the average rental rate or fair market value will look like going forward. Once we've established our market research and understand where the economics should lie, we'll then develop an outcome and strategy plan based on your practice and career goals. Determine what goals and objectives are top priority, what goals and objectives are mid priority, and what items we can concede on in the interest of getting big ticket items. Once we've developed our outcome and strategy plan, we will then pick up the phone and connect with the landlord and commence negotiation. Key here is having all of our due diligence completed well in advance of reaching out and speaking with the landlord. We understand exactly what the objectives are, understanding and having a plan in place for the renewal or relocation or acquisition of building, and then negotiating the key economics. Always start with what matters, and that is the financials. How much rent is to be paid, any inducements, any allowances, any concessions from the landlord, but really what the rental rates will look like, not only today, but for the long-term future, including all escalations and future growth of rental rates. So really the first step is what landlords want when it comes to negotiations, and that's the financials. Once we've documented and established the financials on paper, then we would shift our focus to negotiating the other key technical terms and conditions, all the legal merits of the agreement, all the items, past page 1 and 2, the other 58, 60 or more pages that address the commitment and obligations and relationship between the landlord. So key items here are ensuring that, we have further flexibility, we're minimizing our risk and exposures, we're reducing our liability via the lease agreement, we have clear assignment language built into place, items like death and disability, right of first refusals, are all critical amendments and provisions within the lease agreement that are essential into ensuring that you have a successful long-term relationship with your landlord and a predictable tenancy in the property. Once we've established and amended the lease agreement and established what the lease will look like, prior to signing off and having our client sign off, we look to do a final review and execution of the lease. So before we have you sign the dotted line, important that all the elements that were established 1 through 7 are structured within that final agreement, that all agreed upon terms are consistent with that final form of the lease. Many times, and in a lot of cases that we've dealt with, we spent a number of weeks, sometimes months, negotiating a lease agreement, and at the final iteration of the lease, a landlord pulls a bait and switch, where they go back to the original lease, thinking that the tenant will just sign that, not being aware of the key terms and not being willing to actually go through the lease for a final review. Our attorneys and advisors and negotiators ensure that there's consistency between what has been previously negotiated and what the final form and execution will look like. Once we're comfortable with how the lease is structured, we will then have our client sign the lease agreement and execute that. Critical that that document is held on record. I always recommend to clients, once you have a final lease agreement and any previous documents, ensure that you maintain records of those documents. Ensure that you maintain records not only on your an original printed out hard copy, but have a record on the cloud, on a USB key, and in some cases maintain a record of the lease agreement in your bank vault. In many cases, we've been working on a number of cases last year when Houston had undergone those floods, where a number of doctors reached out to us and essentially said, hey, we need some help as it relates to damage and destruction. However, our leases are under 4 feet of water. And the last thing that you ever want to do in a negotiation is approach the landlord and request a copy of any pre-existing leases because you do not have a secure copy. So key to ensure that you have multiple copies of the lease agreement, one hard copy and multiple soft copies, USB drive, bank vault, and one in the cloud. Critical that you do that. So really, the right treatment plan is following these steps, and when we're involved in every project, whether we're setting up an arm's length lease between property and practice, which you own, or we're establishing a lease agreement on behalf of a tenant in the relationship with another landlord, critical that these steps are followed and not a step is missed in order to have the greatest outcome and position ourselves from a successful lease negotiation and to ensure that we have a winning strategy in place. So some of the key takeaways from today's program are very simple. The details in your lease agreement could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars if left alone. All the terms, conditions, and legalities of the lease agreement can have an impact on your tenancy. And if, for example, there's a provision in the lease that is not in your favor and you end up in default of the lease agreement, that can cause a significant burden to the practice, whether that is practice downtime, forced to default on the lease agreement and premature termination of the lease agreement. It's a significant burden and can be very much so costly to the business, and essentially could cause issues and concerns with having to relocate, practice downtime, and the new practice not being built or demised, and losing patient attrition occurs if we're not able to service our patient needs and our clinical needs for the animal health center or animal hospital. Number two, it's not just about rent. There are a wide variety of other terms and conditions that are involved in the negotiation. Rent is one facet within the negotiations. Our focus is not only on rent, but also ensuring that the legal terms and conditions are there to protect you. It's all about minimizing risk, maximizing flexibility, increasing clinical value, and achieving long-term peace of mind. Ensure that you have an expert that has that has a professional understanding of how to negotiate a well-structured lease agreement, ensure that you are setting up a lease agreement is there to work in your favor in the long run, working as an asset rather than liability. Be strategic. You don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate into your lease. Important that we understand that key facet. Ensure that we understand that if we do not ask the right questions, we will not receive them. So important that you have a professional work on your behalf in representing your interests, that in the case that, we want to make sure that going forward, all items are addressed and have been discussed and negotiated on behalf of our tenants. And lastly, start the process early. An often overlooked process. Whether you own the building and are looking to establish a lease between your practice and property, start the process early and often. Typically 5 years in advance of your exit. Have predictable rental history on paper. Have a relationship between landlord and tenant, even if you're both parties. But also, if you're just leasing the space, start that process 24 months well in advance of the expiration. Timing is valuable. If we start the process early, we can negotiate a more favorable lease agreement. And then lastly, do your homework. Ensure that we have all the research, all documentation on hand, that we understand all of the relationships between landlord and tenant, and that we understand the nature of that relationship. Whether we have a cordial relationship or the landlord is not so great of a landlord and is looking to maximize from their opportunities, whether that's rent or legal terms, recapture the space, demolish the building, redevelop the property. We need to ensure that all of our research is done on the lease agreement well in advance of exercising a renewal or establishment of a lease. So part of today's program and the benefit of joining us today is that we are providing all of our attendees here today with a voucher for a lease analysis. We typically charge about $1,500 to review any lease agreements or to set up a consultation on how to set up a lease agreement. We'll spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease agreement. Our legal team will do a thorough analysis from page 1, cover to cover, all the way to the end to determine what terms, conditions are there, what commitments we have to the landlord, are they in our favor, what liabilities are inherent to the lease agreement. Once we've analyzed the lease agreement, then we'll set up a call with you all to determine what your vision and plan is for the practice, what your long-term goals and objectives are. We'll cover it and determine what traps are there, determine what the ideal will look like in areas that require amending and negotiating to establish a well-structured lease agreement, and then provide you with a plan, how to negotiate effectively, a tactical plan and approach to determine what the ideal approach is for the negotiation so that you do have a winning income. So for those of you that are interested, you can shoot me an email following the program. I'm happy to set up a consultation with you, whether you're a building owner or practice owner in the lease space. Happy to discuss that. We'll be providing you with the rental rates in the area. Our leasing team will pull up our prospectus of the area with key market data to understand where your rent lies in relation to the marketplace, and also determine what the ideal path and way to negotiate the true outcome of the lease agreement. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you all for joining me today. Feel free to email me or give me a call on my office line to schedule your complimentary lease review. So I'd like to thank you all again for joining me today. I'm hoping that today's program was quite valuable. I understand that we did cover a lot of topics today and had to cover that very quickly within a 1-hour time slot. So if any of you do have interest in furthering your understanding of lease agreement, whether you are a tenant or whether you are an owner-occupier, happy to set up a lease review and a consultation with you. My telephone number is 1-866-739-9075, extension 3247, or you can reach me directly on my email, jbanga@cirrusconsultinggroup.com.